The Beatles had come a long way in such a short period of time in the spotlight and had turned rock and roll music into a living, breathing entity. Along with real-world influences, rock and roll music had such an impact as new artists and sounds were popping up in all places. The Beatles were freed from the burden of touring, and they embraced it with an increasingly experimental approach. They would also once again be pioneers in creating one of the very first concept albums. This meant that every song was part of a single story that would take the listener through a singular journey from beginning to end. In November of 1966, the Beatles began their new adventure by recording their 8th album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The process taken to create this album was unlike anything music had ever seen. Along with over 700 hours of recording, the band said that Sgt. Pepper had to be something that was truly one of a kind. The Beatles insisted on making sure that everything was to be different, from microphones right down to the bells of brass instruments and headphones turned into microphones attached to violins. The sessions initially yielded a non-album single, Strawberry Fields Forever, and followed up with another single, Penny Lane. In February of 1967, the official Sgt. Pepper followed in June. The Beatles had created a popular masterpiece, a work of collaborative genius whose bold ambitions enlarged the possibilities and raised the expectations of listening to popular music on record. Sgt. Pepper became a catalyst for an explosion of mass enthusiasm for album-formatted rock that would revolutionize the aesthetics and the economics of the record business in ways that the earlier pop explosions had never done. Sgt. Pepper was the first major rock-pop record to include its complete lyrics, which appeared on the back cover of the record. While the lyrics in most of the songs didn't seem to make much sense, people like literacy professors said that the songs could mean something to us and something completely different to another. The album's elaborate cover also attracted considerable interest of study. A collage designed by pop artists Peter Blake and Jan Hallworth, it depicted the group as a fictional band referred to in the album's title track in front of a crowd of famous people. The Beatles at this point had gone through a massive physical change. The heavy mustaches worn by the group reflected the growing influence of the hippie style. Their brightly colored parodies of military uniforms were looked at as a symbolism of anti-authoritarian and anti-establishment display. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked Sgt. Pepper the number 1 on its list of 500 greatest albums of all time. Love, love, love. On June 25, 1967, the Beatles performed their forthcoming single, All You Need Is Love, to an estimated 350 million viewers on Our World, the first live global television link. Released a week later during the Summer of Love, the song was adopted as a flower power anthem. They would take another trip to Bangor, India, after being introduced to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi for the Transcendental Meditation Retreat. They would receive a devastating phone call telling them that Brian Epstein, the young man who took a risk of becoming the Beatles' manager with next to no experience, had passed away at the age of 32 from an overdose. His death left the group disoriented and fearful about the future. It was a true coming-of-age moment, so to speak, for the band. John had not seen a tragedy such as this since the passing of his mother long before the Beatles came into being. After practically being almost supernatural in the eyes of their loyal fans and even themselves, they were finally brought back down to earth. John Lennon said at the hearing of Brian's passing, a band of 4 that could pretty much achieve anything in the world of music suddenly felt that they had no idea what was going to happen next. The Beatles would take their first step forward without Brian Epstein with their third album and film set, Magical Mystery Tour. The soundtrack to a forthcoming made-for-television film of the same name was released in the UK as a 6th track in early December of 1967. In the United States, the 6 songs were issued on an identically titled album that also included 5 tracks from the band's recent singles. The album featured a very similar sound to Sgt. Pepper, but at some points seemed a little more innovative, especially in sound. In its first 3 weeks, the album set a record of the highest initial sales of any Capitol Records release, and it is the only Capitol compilation later to be adopted in the band's official canon of studio albums. The film was not equally praised, as the film brought the group its first major negative UK press. It was dismissed as blatant rubbish, a kind of fantasy morality played about the grossness and warmth and stupidity of the audience. Although the viewership figures were respectable, thanks to its slating in the press, the film would never be broadcast in the United States. The Beatles, despite their failure of Magical Mystery Tour, would return to the big screen, but not as themselves. The Beatles would be filmed in a cameo for an animated movie, Yellow Submarine, which would be the second time the Beatles would be animated since their Saturday morning cartoon. In January of 1968, Yellow Submarine, which was a song that was already found on the album Revolver, was included with 10 additional tracks, including 4 unreleased studio recordings that made their debut in the film released in June 1968. The film was praised by critics for its music, humor, and innovative animation style. The soundtrack, however, would not get released until 1969. And before that, the Beatles would release what is now known as their most innovative and experimental album in their discography. The album was white, with the 2 words "The Beatles" written in an obscure spot on an angle. Today, it is the double album commonly known as the White Album. Creative inspiration for the album came from a new direction. Without Epstein's guidance present, the group had briefly turned to Maharishi Yogi as their guru. They spent 3 months in his ashram in Rishikesh, India, and it is known as one of their most prolific periods, yielding numerous songs which included a majority of the 30 tracks included on the White Album. Ringo and Paul left early purely due to boredom, and John felt that he was being manipulated as one of his electronics technicians alleged the Maharishi of making sexual advances to his women attendees. George remained with his entourage, which made John furious in the heat of the moment, and he wrote a scathing song titled Maharishi, which would eventually be renamed to the song Sexy Sadie to avoid potential legal issues. While there had been tensions seen between the band members in the recording sessions for the White Album, which stretched from late May to mid-October of 1968, they saw the relations of the Beatles getting worse. Ringo quit the band for 2 weeks, causing Paul to play drums on Back in the USSR and Dear Prudence. At the same time, John had lost interest in collaborating with Paul, whose contribution Obla Di Obla Da he referred to as shit. However, tensions were further aggravated by John's romance with a young artist named Yoko Ono. John insisted on bringing Yoko to recording sessions despite the group's well-established understanding that significant others should not be allowed into the studio. John described the White Album as every track as an individual track. There isn't any Beatles music on it. While the White Album is their most original and standalone album, it is known as the band's least favorite, and it was a clear identification of the start of the Beatles' breakup. The last 2 years of the Beatles together as a single unit were not the best of times. Although Let It Be was the Beatles' final album release, it was largely recorded before their 13th release, Abbey Road. George Martin suggested that they record an album of new material, rehearse it, and then perform it before a live audience for the very first time on record and on film. Originally intended for a 1-hour television special to be called Beatles at Work, much of the album's content came from extensive rehearsals beginning in January of 1969. Martin said that the project was not at all a happy recording experience. It was a time when relations between the Beatles were at their lowest. John described the sessions as hell, the most miserable on earth, and for George, the low of all time. Irritated by both John and Paul, George walked out for 5 days and threatened to leave the band unless they abandoned the live performance, and instead focused on finishing a new album, using songs recorded from the TV special. The other band members agreed and salvaged the footage shot for the TV production for the use of a feature film. In an effort to alleviate tensions within the band and improve the quality of their live sound, George invited keyboardist Billy Preston to participate in the last 9 days of the sessions. Preston is the only musician ever to receive an acknowledgement on an official Beatles release. At the conclusion of the rehearsals, the band filmed what would be their final live performance on the rooftop of the Apple Corps Studios on January 3rd, 1969. The Beatles began to record Abbey Road on July 2nd, 1969. 2 days later, the world would hear John Lennon's voice, but it would not be a Beatles song they were listening to. The song was John Lennon's first solo single, Give Peace a Chance, credited to the Plastic Ono Band. On August 20th, 1969, the Beatles finished recording the song I Want You, She's So Heavy, the last song in which all four Beatles were together in the same studio. House of Cards would officially collapse on the 20th of September in 1969 as John Lennon announced his departure from the Beatles, but agreed to withhold public announcement to avoid undermining sales of their forthcoming album. Released 6 days later after Lennon's declaration, Abbey Road sold 4 million copies within 3 months and topped the UK charts for a total of 17 weeks. The album received mixed reviews, although the medley met with general acclaim. For the still unfinished Get Back album, one last song, George Harrison's I Me Mine, was recorded on the 3rd of January, 1970. The album would soon have a new title, Let It Be. Before Let It Be's release, the fans would be given a new album titled Hey Jude, the project conceived by Alan Klein and Apple Records. Hey Jude was a compilation of selected Beatles recordings from 1964 to 1967 that had not appeared on a Capitol album in the United States. The songs included Paperback Writer, Lady Madonna, and Revolution. The title song Hey Jude, which was originally recorded as a single in 1968, was a song written by Paul for John's son Julian, born to him from his now ex-wife Cynthia, the girl who he courted since the days of the Quarrymen and the woman responsible for giving the Beatles their name. John did not participate in the compilation of Let It Be, and on April 10, 1970, Paul announced his departure from the Beatles. On May 8, 1970, Let It Be was released with the very last Beatles US single, The Long and Winding Road. The Let It Be documentary film followed later that month, and it would win the 1970 Academy Award for Best Original Song Score. After that, it was official. The Beatles, 4 men who changed the landscape of music forever, had officially reached the end of their time.
Many times I've been alone.
A new decade had begun, and seeing that the Beatles were not going to be a part of it left many with an empty space in their hearts. No one would have ever dreamed that a group of guys who seemed to be as close as brothers would end their time together on such a sour note. A world aching for peace and prosperity was only met with war, death, and destruction. Yet music kept on being a driving force for change, peace, and love. While the Beatles were no longer going to lead this revolution together, it didn't mean that music was going to stop. It would also mark the beginning of a new chapter for each of these 4 living legends of music.